Well, welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Charles Good. Our guest for this episode is Candace Doby, who combines a decade of research on courage with her experiences traveling the world solo and a 16-year award-winning marketing career. In this episode, we talk about the habits that are crucial for courageous leaders to have, why being uncomfortable is good training to be more courageous, and how to foster a courage-ready culture. Candace encourages all of us to be courageous, not fearless. I hope you enjoy. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we engage with esteemed thought leaders and explore research-backed strategies and techniques that empower leaders at every level to achieve meaningful results that drive lasting change. Welcome to the program, Candace.
Thank you, Charles. So happy to be here.
So let's talk about some habits that everyone can do to grow their courage muscle. And the first habit that you mentioned is make your own decisions. Most people don't like deciding for themselves because they don't want to take the responsibility for their choices, but that's not a good approach if you want to develop courage.
Many leaders, I see this at leadership at all levels. We don't want to make the hard decisions sometimes because ultimately we don't want to be responsible for that outcome, particularly if that outcome is less than ideal. So many people would rather have someone else tell them what to do so they don't have to be responsible for the outcome. And one of the ways that we can start to break this down, this habit, is we can make a commitment to making our own decisions every day. And I mean little decisions. Like, when you're going to lunch with your friend and your friend, asks you where you want to eat. And you're like, oh no, you decide. Where do you want to eat? Right. And you don't want to make the decision because you don't want it to be wrong. If the food's not good, you don't want to be responsible. But that's just a small way that you can make a decision. And what happens when we make these decisions in and outside of the workplace, what happens is we start to build up our ability, our reliability on our own skills and our own decision making. And that's what we really want to do. We want to build up our belief and confidence in our own decision making. So, large decisions, small decisions, we need to train ourselves and kind of habituate ourselves to make them ourselves.
Well, that approach is effective because I know my daughter is kind of like that as well. She doesn't like to make any decisions. And if I were to tell her, you need to start making all your decisions, it would be overwhelming. So start small. Start with some of those decisions that aren't that profound, that impact you in such a profound way, but just start small and build it up over time, which then will help you in having more courage and making more decisions yourself. How about remember your strengths? So it's always essential to remind yourself of your strengths on a regular basis because they're quite easy to forget. We normally don't focus on our strengths, but courage uses them as important clues about your abilities.
That's right. Your strengths are something that you don't think about every day. I don't think about my strengths every day, but when I am confronted with my weaknesses, I tend to focus on them. And I don't think I'm alone in that. I think that's a very human thing to do. But Charles, there's so much that we have experienced over our careers, over our lifetime. There's so many things that we're good at as leaders that we already have the evidence for, that we know how to solve a particular problem because we've solved it before. And so it becomes really, really important on the journey to acting courageous and building up your capacity for courageous leadership. It becomes really important to remember the goodness, to remember your strengths, to remember your previous wins, to remember the goodness. Your brain, I say this like your brain's an adversary, but your brain is not necessarily going to serve up your strengths as easily as it serves up your weaknesses. And so that's why this does take effort. That's why I say remember them. Make it a conscious practice of remembering the things that you're good at, and you can keep those top of mind more easily if you make that a practice.
And every courageous action in the history of the world, like you mentioned, involves risk. So making a risk-taking routine is valuable as you're building up this courageous muscle. I love the risk a day challenge. The point is taking a risk each day is to learn how to settle in your discomfort, which people aren't good at, and recognize the potential instead of trying to shy away from it, remove it, or just ignore it.
One of the most impactful things that we can do if we want to build ourselves up as courageous leaders, if we want to flex our courage muscle and make it stronger, is we have to take risk every day. We have to practice taking risk. Even if it's not every day, it needs to be regular. Abraham Maslow, the person who formed the hierarchy of needs, he's the one who said that the people who reach the height of their potential, those are the people who make risk-taking routine. They choose growth over safety every single time. And that is what is important. If we are going to build up our courage muscle, we have to practice taking risks. And this is where starting small comes into play again. So every risk that you take, it doesn't need to be blockbuster for you to start building up that muscle. It might be that you're in a room of people that you trust and you want to say something that is a little bit different than what the prevailing perspective is in the room. And because this is a room you trust, it might be a low stakes risk. You don't have that risk that you might be expelled from the group or you might be isolated. These are the rooms in which you want to take risk because the stakes are lower and you can start to evaluate, well, what are my emotions? What are the outcomes? Do I rely on the skills that I have? And from there you want to build. You want to build upon the risk that you take. And that's what we need. That's what we need to be able to really flex that courage muscle is to take risk on a really regular basis.
Well, and I know for me and for others, I assume too, is that I can acknowledge the discomfort and then I want to tame it. But it's really hard for me to lean into the discomfort, to reside in it for a long enough period of time to learn to get more comfortable with it. Are there any tips, tools, strategies that you can help our listeners in regarding that residing in the discomfort so that you learn the necessary lessons and build your courage muscle?
I like that you're bringing this up because discomfort is an inherent part of courageous action. You are going to be uncomfortable acting courageously. And this is why a lot of people don't move forward with acting courageously. And what do we need to do then if discomfort is a part of this? We have to be able to become familiar with it. A lot of people run away from discomfort. You don't want to feel it, so you don't say the thing that you need to say. But we need to become familiar with it because what we are familiar with, we can manage. And one of the most important things that we can do when it comes to being familiar and managing our discomfort is we have to actually practice being uncomfortable. So there is that practice again. One of the things that I do for myself, and I would recommend to other people who just want to get practice in flexing their courage muscle, is court opportunities for discomfort every day. And if you don't do it every day, make it regular. But what I can tell you is that every single day includes an opportunity for you to sit in discomfort, whether that's a conversation you just had with someone, whether that is if you're introverted and you are in a place that's unfamiliar and speaking up or networking with people in the room, that could be uncomfortable. But these are the low stakes moments where you actually want to court discomfort so that you can get comfortable and familiar with how it feels. So that's one thing, one easy thing, not easy necessarily, but one quick tip or strategy that I would have in terms of getting familiar with discomfort is you have to court it. Play a game with yourself and just notice uncomfortable moments that kind of surface throughout the day and pick one and sit in it and see how you feel and if your tendency is to run away or if you can actually sit in it and what you learn from it.
Assuming we can reside there, right? And we want to know why it's there, just not acknowledging it. How are how can we better tame that discomfort? Because the only strategy that I know is that you just repeated exposure to it over time will help and get you more comfortable with being uncomfortable, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that that is the most powerful strategy. I think repeated exposure is a powerful strategy for taming this the discomfort, excuse me. I think we can even use an example from a completely different industry for this, but we can think about, a lion tamer at the circus. And we can think about, well, what does it really take? This to me seems like an uncomfortable situation being in a cage or being in close proximity with a lion. And we can think about our discomfort as the lion. But what does it really take to get into the same space as that lion? It is repeated exposure. It is getting comfortable being around it. And then you take another step forward and then another step forward. So it really is the repeated exposure and challenging yourself to get a little bit closer and a little bit closer. So I do think that repeated exposure is probably one of the biggest things. But here's the thing, so often our natural response is to run. Our natural response when we feel discomfort is to run away from it. And that's why it sounds simple, but it's very powerful in order to expose yourself to discomfort on a repeated basis so that you can habituate yourself to it.
Another great analogy that you use is adopt an experimenter's mindset when you want more courage. So I love, focus on the process, not the outcome, and even detach yourself from the outcome as you're experimenting with these courageous acts.
Right. So often, like I mentioned, we are thinking about what could happen if we were to move forward and take courageous action. We're thinking about, I might fail. This might lead to rejection. This might lead to isolation. And I might not have access to that group of people if I say the wrong thing. These are the things that we are thinking about. And when we think about those things, we can stop ourselves from acting courageously. So we already know one of the things that you need to do is you need to look at the other side of the risk and what is the risk of not taking action. The other thing that we can do is we can unwrap ourselves from the outcome itself. Courage is a process, and it's more important to pay attention to the process and to fully engage in the process than worry about the outcome. And I like to use the example of a scientist doing an experiment. A scientist has a hypothesis, something that they're interested in or curious about. And so what do? Sure, they come up with, this is what I think might happen. But when they actually engage in the experiment, they have to divest from the outcome. They have to explore and discover whatever comes about as a result of doing that experiment. And so rather than thinking about the outcome, what you put your energy into and what a scientist puts their energy into is the process, making it an accurate process, a precise process, one that doesn't have experimenter bias, one that is clean, one that is viable. And that's what we want to do too. Put your energy into the process versus the outcome.
Now, there are certain courageous actions that all leaders need to do on a fairly regular basis. And I like to go into just a few of those because I think, this is from new leaders all the way up to senior level managers. I hear this a lot is giving critical feedback is one of those, a courageous act that they don't do a good job of. A lot of them just don't do it at all, right? They ignore it. They let it fester to where it just really becomes an issue, or they do it the wrong way, where they've just had enough and they just explode and blow up. What's a better way to give feedback under the courageous leadership model?
Feedback is so important, as you mentioned, Charles. I mean, if you're a leader and you're really trying to prime your team for excellence and higher performance, giving feedback is critical. The first thing that I'll say about this is a lot of times when leaders are giving feedback, they do focus on something you need to improve on. So they're approaching their team member or their colleague with a story and approach of inadequacy. You might be doing something wrong, you need to improve. And that doesn't necessarily create the most inspiring space for people to improve. So, one of the things that I like to also say is that can we, as leaders, flip that approach from needing to approve to capacity for growth? So when you're talking to your team members, you are sharing with them that you see the capacity for them to grow. Growth is a better way, I think, to deal with feedback when you really want to tell somebody to improve, is to inspire them to grow. So that's one thing that I would just say there. The other thing about giving feedback is, yes, I think there is a way to give it that can be impactful. There are a lot of leaders that I've talked to after I've done sessions or speeches, and they say, I really want to lead with the positive. I want to lead with the positives because that eases me into the critical feedback that I really want to deliver. And what I would say is, as a leader, I would not suggest that. What I would actually suggest is that you give a quick intro to the critical feedback. Hey, Charles, there's something that I wanted to share with you. Do you have a moment? Or something quick and brief. A lot of people want to lead with positive feedback because it makes it easier for them. They are lessening the blow for them. They're not really thinking about the person in front of them. Usually when we're about to have a conversation where we're delivering feedback, people get anxious. And that's why you want to make your introduction brief and then you want to lead in with the critical feedback first. And I know that might not be the easiest thing to do, but it's helpful for not only you but the person you're talking to. One, because there have been studies that show that when given a choice, between positive and negative feedback, which do you want to hear first? Overwhelmingly, people want to hear negative feedback first to get it out of the way. One of the reasons you want to give the negative feedback first is because after you deliver it, a person's body is in high alert. So now they're really paying attention. They're not really paying attention before you deliver it. And so you deliver the negative feedback, they're in high alert. Now, what you want to do, you don't want to give the positive feedback next. What you actually want to deliver is you want to deliver how they can incorporate, how they can fold in that feedback into their professional day. So, what are they supposed to do with it? We can't just give people feedback and not tell them specifics about what they need to, how they can fold that feedback in. So that's an important second piece. And then after that, then after you do those things, there's something called proactive enhancement. And that's when, again, we're at full alert. Then you can give the positive feedback. And you want to make positive feedback very, very detailed because your brain isn't going to do a great job of remembering it because the negative feedback feels threatening. So that's what we remember. So spend a lot of time talking about the positive on the back end.
How about for another common scenario, which I see a lot today with leaders, with managers, is that their inability to say no, and they become more overwhelmed with work, which can lead to burnout, decreased productivity, turnover, toxic culture. All of these potential negative outcomes act as kind of uppercuts, like you mentioned, to the bottom line. How can a leader get better at saying no?
This is important because this is about whatever you're saying, no to, you're saying yes to something else. And whatever you're saying yes to, you're saying no to something else. And so when we get in a pattern of saying yes to the things we know we don't have the capacity to do, we're saying no to other things. And for leaders, what this means is we might be saying no to the development of our team members. We might be saying no to crafting, better visions and strategies for our people to follow. And so that's something that we really have to keep in mind. If you're constantly saying yes, you're saying no to something else. So, how do you say no then to the things that you say no to? Um, there are two things that we have to keep in mind. And that is when we say no, or the reason why we're afraid of saying no is because we don't want to jeopardize relationships with the people who are maybe asking us to do things. So if you're a leader and you have a colleague or your supervisor or boss comes to you asking you to do something that you don't have the capacity for, what feels very threatening is if I say no, that relationship might be at stake or in jeopardy. So that's one side of it. The other side of it is we have a responsibility to ourselves as people and professionals to honor ourselves and our capacity and our balance and our mental health. And so those really are the two things that you have to remember and are at play when it's difficult to say no. You don't want to jeopardize your relationships, but then you have this responsibility to honor yourself. And so when we're saying no, it becomes really important that we do so in a way where we are respecting the people who are coming to us, and we are using and conjuring the courage for that values driven purpose, which in this case is ourselves.
Love to talk about forming deeper connections because that's so critical in this day and age, and how being courageous will help you do that.
Yeah. So, one of the things that I think is very easy to do when you need to say no, number one, practice saying no. We've talked about practice a lot, but it's really important when it comes to courage. Many people have a hard time saying no because they don't have the words to say it. They literally don't know what words they should use to say no. So, the advice that I like to give is find three simple ways that you can pull out of your back pocket when the opportunity comes for you to use them so that you can pull one out and actually use it. One of the ones that I like to use in some form or fashion is thank you for thinking about me for this opportunity. I don't have the ability to work on it now, but is there a chance I could work on it later? Something in that form. When you're saying no, one of the things that can help you feel better and the person you're talking to is if you have to say no, reserving an opportunity to work on it later is respecting them and it's honoring yourself. So that I just wanted to share that one strategy. In terms of developing deep relationships with your team, this is critical. In the work of courage, particularly when we're building an environment, we're creating an environment where the people in that environment feel like they can take courageous action, they can take risk and not be retaliated against for taking those risks and not be harmed by taking those risks. Foundationally, what we need are very trusting, deep relationships. And so, in order to develop trusting relationships, one of the things leaders can do is they can allow other people, the people on their team, to see them taking courageous action. So they can allow other people to see them doing the hard things, to speaking up when it's difficult to do, to stepping up when it's difficult to do, because that helps create trust. When you can see your leader doing it, it provides not only a path to follow, but it helps you to understand this is a space in which I might be able to do the same thing.
The final piece, just like to touch upon, is what does it mean to have a courage ready culture? If you could just provide some insight or maybe a few tips on what are kind of the first steps in identifying that and really nurturing that type of culture within your organization.
So a courage ready culture, it is an environment where the people in that environment are equipped to take worthwhile risks. So that ultimately is what we are that's the end goal. The end goal is creating a place where people can take risk and they can take them freely, they can take them without the risk of retaliation or intimidation or retribution. And so equipping them is number one, it's giving them the ability, it's getting them to understand how to evaluate courage using the components that we've discussed. It's evaluating the risk, the reasons, and the resources. So that's giving them the ability. The support is really about advocating for your team. It's finding the yes in their ideas. When you have team members come to you with new ideas, with new ways to think about how you're doing business on the team or you're approaching a problem on the team, finding the yes in their ideas is one of the ways that you can create those relationships and trust on the team. So while the entire idea might not be something that can be greenlit, finding the piece of their ideas that you can think further about and encourage them to think further about is again creating a supportive environment. Support also comes in the form of protection against outside interference, let's call it that. So it's protecting your team from, outside interference, strategic shifts that are sending them scrambling to do their work. How can you protect them? So this is support. And then that desire piece, Charles, is really about what we mentioned when I talked about courageous leaders. First, the very first step in creating a courage ready culture is just letting other people, letting your team see you take courageous action. That's one of the foundational ways that you start to create this team. It starts with the leader taking their own courageous actions first.
When leaders committed to a courage ready culture, like you mentioned, prioritize curiosity, collaboration, and I love this, finding the yes in their team members' ideas. Really good stuff. Candace, before we end today's episode, is there one, we've talked about lots of tools, tips, strategies, is there one action that leaders can take right away to become more courageous and build their courage muscle?
I think the very first thing that leaders should do to flex their courage muscle goes back to one of the questions that you asked me previously about discomfort. And I think it really is for their own sake, not necessarily to share it with their team, but for themselves as a person and professional. One of the first things that they can do is leverage opportunities that pop up every single day to be uncomfortable, but to actually sit in those opportunities, to feel the feeling of discomfort so that they can start to navigate within it and tame it. So that's what I would say. I would say the opportunities for discomfort that come up in your day, actually court them and actually take them and do something with them so that you can start to evaluate your emotions and outcomes within them. That's a foundational first step.
Wonderful. Thank you, Candace, for joining me today on the program. Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you and learn more about your work.
You can find everything about what I'm up to at my website, CandaceDoby.com. That's probably the hub and the best place to go.
I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.